Towards the end of the 1980s, it became apparent that many British towns and cities were gradually but perceptibly becoming identical. One noticed this phenomenon appeared to accelerate, and within a decade the process was complete. Where once the distinguishing characteristics of a place, a corner, a main street, a square, had each enjoyed their own personality, now a fungus-like growth of dreary shop fronts, damp precincts and hot, airless cafes had all but taken over. Walls were thinner, ceilings lower, floors dirtier. The old institutional buildings, once representative of moral and social authority, churches and banks, were stripped of their fittings, filled with widescreen televisions and turned into a vast barn-like bars. All through the town and through every town, the same 24 or so brand names could be found, repeated over and over above the wide doorways. On the edges of these identical towns and cities, chilly hinterlands of carpet showrooms, DIY superstores and sportswear clearance warehouses stretched off in all directions as far as the eye could see, and even further, because at some point on the horizon their prairie-like expanses merged with those of the adjoining conurbations, like the land masses on maps of the prehistoric world. A few fields of wiry grass, colourless in the pinkish gleam of immensely tall streetlights, were the only slight variations, a tiny swell in the sea of sameness that occurred within the landscape. To entertain the inhabitants of this new mono-environment, the various strands of the national media came up with cheap, nasty, tasteless gimmicks, in addition to which strong alcohol was made available in the same flavours as children's sweets and snacks. Toffee crisp flavoured vodka shots, bubblegum tequila, Monster Munch Bacardi. The latest cars were named after the most popular dishes on Italian and Indian takeaway menus. The Vauxhall Corma, the new Fiat Madras. Mobile phones destroyed the distinction between public and personal space. Young women started to talk like camp gay men. When you applied for a mortgage, you were given a voucher for a free mochaccino latte. The middle two shelves of magazines in every newsagent's shop comprised a broad horizontal stripe, reddish-orange in colour, of identical-looking young women, every one of whom had been photographed with their thumbs in the waistband of their knickers. Gratuitous male aggression was not only encouraged, but celebrated. Local newspapers became directories of horror. Every week, it seemed, unbelievably vile and stupid people did unbelievably vile and stupid things to each other, and to anyone or anything which happened to cross their path. Animals in particular suffered at their hands. Kittens were shot in the face at close range. Ducklings were taken from a pond and stamped on. A dog was hung from a tree in a sack and beaten to death. The wealthiest and most fashionable people in this new Britain were made even wealthier and more fashionable by poorer people who paid to look at pictures of them going to private parties and expensive restaurants, or to read accounts of their luxurious lifestyles and love affairs. Pensioners began to dress like rappers. Clumsy fistfights broke out between businessmen on crowded trains. Toddlers were known to stab one another with screwdrivers. Truancy was rife. Most jobs were dull and poorly paid. The weather became first mild, then humid. The sun looked bigger and redder and lower in the sky. Dead polar bears were found washed up on the shores of Scandinavia. These events did not occur in a way that was particularly dramatic, let alone apocalyptic. Rather, they had a sluggish momentum. Their progress was incremental, as opposed to declamatory. It was as though history had ended, and the concept of a future too, and all that was left was the sweeping up, at the close of a hot, windy day, of low white skies. Horses, their ribs showing through their skin, stood very still on the edges of toxic landfill sites. Jut-jawed, heavy-browed, tattooed on calf or small of back, territorially hostile, the last of the consumers became more like scavengers. Their expressions were hostile, and they were swift to take offence. Their children were first spoilt and then cursed for being alive. It was only when one managed to somehow gain a great height over this new landscape and look down upon it that you realised what had happened. In the space of a relatively short amount of time, the whole of Britain had turned into one enormous shop, and everything that had not assisted the shop in making more profit had been either forced into dereliction or declared eccentric, and thus after just a few years all that was lovely or gentle, or to use an old-fashioned word, seemly, had been destroyed.